First of all, just thank you so much for meeting with me again.
Not a problem.
Yeah, as I said last time, I got so much out of your course, and then I've been rewatching the last conversation we had together
Mhm.
and got so much out of that as well. Highlighted how little I know, which is always a great thing to discover. Obviously, the last call was a debate between you and Bernardo Kastrup. It quickly transpired that not only do you have very different views about the ultimate nature of reality, but also even how to approach the question. Um, and so, and just to say before we go in, I'm not a professional philosopher, so this conversation will be probably at a much slower pace,
Mhm.
which I'm hoping will make it beneficial to other people who also aren't professional philosophers and they can uh, keep up and uh, at the level of my understanding.
Sure.
Um, And yeah, maybe before we dive into a couple of big questions, which maybe frame the conversation, which is your view on the point of this kind of conversation in the first place, the point of doing philosophy and the potential benefit of this philosophical view in particular.
Well, I think the point of doing philosophy is that philosophy can be fundamentally transformative. It can reshape the way that we understand reality. It can reshape the way that we understand ourselves and who we are. It can reshape the way we understand our relationships to other people. And it can transform our reactive attitudes, can make us either more angry or less angry, depending on the kind of philosophy we do, more patient or less patient, perhaps, depending on the kind of philosophy we do. But as cognitive beings, and as beings whose cognition is so saturated with language and whose existence is so essentially social, by talking with one another, by reading, by thinking, by debating, um, we develop a far deeper understanding and transform who we are. So that's why we do philosophy. And why think about the self and the person? Well, those are some of the most important issues we could possibly think about. What kind of being are we? How should we live our lives? What kinds of reactions, habitual reactions, make sense and which ones are harmful, and so forth. And so I don't think it's necessarily just a kind of idle speculative exercise, though one could approach it that way perhaps and enjoy it as much as one enjoys doing crossword puzzles or Sudokus. But I think that it's also useful as a mechanism for self-transformation and self-investigation.
And my understanding of which again is very limited, just to acknowledge it up front, my understanding of the Buddhist perspective on this is that suffering is essentially linked to some kind of clinging, which is again linked to the wrong view of how things are, how things exist. And he's teaching on emptiness, when perceived correctly, automatically or are correlated with a reduction in clinging and hence a reduction in suffering. Is that your view as well, or do you?
Yeah, that's the hope. So let me spell it out in maybe a little bit more detail than that, not much, but just to make sure we have all the little pieces of the puzzle in place. Um, all of this is coming from the second noble truth, the truth of the origin of suffering. Um, And the account there is that the two proximal causes of suffering, the immediate causes, are attachment and aversion. We either suffer because we don't get what we want, right? And we also sometimes suffer from the fact that we've got what we don't want. The first one's kind of the basis of the blues, and the second one is the basis of country music. Um, so sometimes you've got stuff you don't want, and that makes you suffer, like headaches and too much work to do, and Republican administrations and things like that. And that leads to aversion, which leads to suffering. And sometimes you can't get what you do want. Um, Pleasure, friendship, happiness in life, success in your projects, and that leads to suffering as well. Um, Now, the Buddhist diagnosis of attachment and aversion is that as egocentric attitudes, these both derive from a whole complex of what's usually called something like primal confusion, sometimes ignorance, but I think ignorance isn't the right term for this. We want to think about it as a fundamental confusion about the nature of reality. And that fundamental confusion has a number of different dimensions. One dimension is the dimension that you referred to, seeing things as non-empty versus empty. That is, thinking that things have their properties intrinsically. The things we want are intrinsically valuable. The things to which we're averse are intrinsically unpleasant. And one can reduce the attachment and the aversion by seeing these things as less reified and seeing their consequences as less important. But that's only a piece of it. Another piece is the piece that's often called self-grasping. That is, thinking of myself as having a kind of core special identity, subjectivity, and agency, and hence not thinking of myself as an interdependent part of the world, but seeing myself as the subject of the world, as somebody who acts on the world. And you hear this even in very sophisticated conversation where people will talk about the relationship between the brain and the world, or and you wonder, well, last I heard, brains were in the world. But there's this immediate kind of atavistic subconscious tendency to pull ourselves away from the world, and then to see everything else in response to us. So it's often called the twofold self-grasping of I and mine. I grasp myself as this particular individual and everything else only as it pertains to me. So I think of my enemies, my friends, my views, somebody else's views, and so forth, and develop attachment and aversion as a response to that as well. Because when we posit ourselves as selves, we end up cultivating a great deal of attachment to who we are. And then depending upon the relation in which we see things to ourselves, further attachment or else aversion. So the point that I really wanted to make there is that, well, you're absolutely right in the broad characterization. If what we're talking about ourselves and persons and the metaphysics of identity, that has a very special role in the context of primal confusion. And that's because we tend to center the world on ourselves. And that's something that is useful to displace. And by doing that, the Buddhist sensibility is that we can really fundamentally transform our affective and behavioral lives as well. Not reacting out of an atavistic self-concern, but acting out of a recognition of interdependence and belonging. Seeing ourselves not as agents who act on the world, but as beings in the world.
And framed within this idea of one of the purposes of philosophy as transformational and a reduction of suffering, would you say that, well, as long as someone has a philosophy that is doing that for them in that moment, that's good enough? Or because obviously the debate you and Bernardo had was quite rigorous, and that tradition goes back a long time where people felt it was important to get this right.
Yes, that's right.
Is it important to get it right in the same way as it can feel important to win a game of chess? Or is it important because, oh, getting it right will ultimately reduce a layer of suffering that wouldn't be reduced if we don't get it right? Does the question make sense?
It does, and it's the latter. We're not getting it right to score points. And it's not that anything roughly in the ballpark, anything that reduces some suffering is enough. Because the Buddhist analysis is that our life is entirely permeated by suffering. It might be worth talking a bit about that a little bit, because we jumped right into the second truth and we left out the first truth. And the first truth is the truth that the world is permeated by suffering. Now, that suffering in turn is described in three different ways, or classified in three different ways is the better way to put it. The most obvious kind, and one that's perfectly common, is what we call evident suffering, the suffering that's really obvious to us. And that includes things like headaches and sore throats. It includes getting old, and it includes being tired, and it includes being bored or having somebody annoy you or shout at you, being stuck in traffic, being stuck in an airplane. All of those things, those are just the ordinary slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And the world is deeply permeated with that, right? people are suffering terribly in many ways. I mean, think about people in Gaza or people in Ukraine or in Sudan. But you can also think about people in, the United States or the United Kingdom. You can think about people who are cold or hot, people who are poor, people who are dying, people whose children are dying, people who know somebody whose house was consumed by fire, people whose house was consumed by fire. All of those are sources of suffering. And so the Buddha's beginning insight was that suffering isn't just an occasional thing that we sometimes encounter, but that we are encountering it all the time, even at that level of suffering. Now, sometimes my students say, oh, that's just such a downer. And it's not really true, because sometimes I feel really happy. I'm with my friends and having a good time, or watching a good movie, or, smoking some good dope, or whatever it is that makes you have a good time. And the response to that, it's a very, very nice one, is that this shows us that even pleasure in samsara is a source of suffering. The 8th century Buddhist philosopher Shantideva puts it really beautifully. He says, pleasure in samsara, in the ordinary world, is like licking honey from a razor blade. And it's a really nice point to make, because here's what you want to say to somebody who says, hey, don't tell me I'm always suffering. I'm really happy right now. You say, well, do you not know what's happening in Sudan? Do you not know what's happening in Gaza? Do you not know how many people are dying really awful deaths right now? You have a choice. You either care about that, in which case, even if you're not noticing it, you're suffering because you're sad and you're sympathetic, or else you don't care at all about that. And if you don't care about that at all, then you're suffering from being an asshole, which is a kind of technical way of saying you're suffering from not being the kind of person you really want to be. And so that level of just ordinary suffering, the Buddha argued, is every place in our existence. Second level of suffering, one that underlies that one, is the suffering of change, suffering of transformation. And that's the fact that everything that we enjoy decays after a while, or becomes a source even of suffering. So, think about youth. It's a really nice thing, but trust me, it decays. And you become an old guy, and then you start hurting a lot. Beauty, it decays too. Friendships break up, relationships break up. Good economies turn sour. Jobs that are great at first become boring after a while. That first scoop of ice cream when you pull that, 2-liter tub of ice cream out of the freezer late at night tastes really good. But by the time you get to the bottom, it's kind of sickening. So this is all part of the suffering of change, that things don't remain intrinsically pleasurable. They start that way maybe, but they don't end up that way. And even when they appear to be, they may themselves be real sources of suffering. But the third one is the really important one here, and that's the suffering of pervasive condition. And that refers to the fact that we are not in control of our own lives. We might be doing everything we can to stay healthy, and a drunk driver might kill us one day. We might have, do everything we can to lead a really productive life, and then we discover that through a stupid error, we did something that caused tremendous harm to people. We live in a world in which we have very limited control over our futures. A geneticist doctor of mine once said that our most important responsibility is to choose our grandparents carefully. That might be right. That's how we can make sure that we become the kinds of people we want to and lead the kinds of lives we want. But it's damn difficult to do. And it's that suffering of pervasive conditioning, that being out of control and subject to causes and conditions all the time, that's really kind of in the background of all of this. So if we think of ourselves as autonomous agents, as selves who are different from the world, who aren't causally connected to the world, then we're going to constantly suffer from the disjuncture between what we think we are and what we actually are. So that anything short of dislodging the illusion of selfhood, the illusion of autonomy, the illusion of independence, anything short of that is going to leave that fundamental level of suffering in place.
Mm. And again, I'm also a beginner, let's say, in idealism or Advaita, but I've been exposed to it more, let's say. I'm a little bit more familiar with it. So just to frame everything I say, if it sounds like I'm not making myself out to be an authority, I'm just
Sure.
expressing my understanding of it at this point. My understanding of uh, that kind of mind-only idealism is that it also negates a kind of personal selfhood. At the
Yes.
most, I could say I am a epiphenomenal arising in a large, vast expanse of consciousness, but there's no
Hmm.
me here controlling what's happening. In other words, it speaks to the same kind of suffering you're speaking to.
Yep.
But if I've understood you, um, especially the Prasangika approach to this sees consciousness as also something that's empty to be seen through, that is dependent, that doesn't have
Exactly.
inherent existence, etc., etc. Are you saying that there's a level of suffering almost that comes with people comes for people who take this mind-only view from the Prasangika view? But again, and feel free to reframe my question if you feel like it could be reformulated in a way
Sure.
that makes more sense.
No, that's really useful. In fact, your question is interestingly ambiguous between two questions. And I just want to pull them apart for a minute because
Sure.
it might be fun to think about both of them. I'm not sure. One, the way you began formulating it was about Advaita Vedanta and the distinction between the Buddhist perspective and the Advaita Vedanta perspective. The second one, when you started using the term mind only, that's a term that's often used to denote a particular school of Buddhist philosophy, the Yogacara Chittamatra view. Now, the interesting thing is that the opponents of the Yogacara within Buddhism often call it crypto Vedanta. And lots of orthodox Indian philosophers who are critical of the Vedantins charge them with being crypto Buddhists, by
Hmm.
which they mean mind only Buddhists. So there is a tradition of thinking about Yogacara and Vedanta in the same way.
Hmm.
But Yogacara and Vedanta are also subtly and importantly different, despite a lot of overlap in
Hmm.
outlook. Um, and so I want to be careful when I use the word mind only. I'll be using it in reference to the Buddhist Chittamatra Yogacara school. And if I'm using Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta, I'll be talking about the Vedanta school
Hmm.
specifically. The biggest difference between them, and it really is an important difference, um, is the question of our relationship to Brahman or some Atman. It's important to Advaita that where the Advaita comes from is our union with Brahman, or a kind of cosmic self or cosmic soul. Whereas in Yogacara, like in any Buddhist schools, there is no Atman, right? These are an-Atman, no self schools. And so when Yogacharans talk about reality being constituted by mind only, they're making a phenomenological point, not a metaphysical point. The Advaita Vedantins are talking about the fundamental nature of reality, that reality really is Brahman, and that the apparent reality of interdependent things and personal selves, as you pointed out correctly, is Maya. That's illusion. So it all relies on a Maya Tattva distinction, or an illusion reality distinction, that distinguishes the world as it appears to us from the unitary reality or the non-dual reality of Brahman. Um, The Yogacara school is also grounded on the idea that all of our experience is illusion. And that's where the deep parallel comes in. Um, and remember that in any Indian context, when we talk about illusion, we talk about Maya, we're always talking about the difference between the way something exists and the way it appears. We're not talking about the appearance of the non-existent. We're talking about a disjuncture between appearance and reality. So when we take classic examples like the rope and the snake, and we say the rope appears to me to be a snake in the dim light, it's important that it's a rope, an actual rope that appears to be a snake. When we talk about a mirage as being an illusion, we don't mean there are no mirages. We mean that mirages are refraction patterns of light that appear to be water. So in the context of Advaita Vedanta, we have a world that appears to be existent, but is in fact nothing but the manifestation or the play of Brahman. In the Yogacharan perspective, on the other hand, the illusion is described slightly differently. The illusion under which we lead our lives is that there's a firm subject-object duality, with my subjectivity on one side and the object on another. So far, it sounds like Vedanta. But that part of that subject-object duality is this reflexive attitude that the world that appears to me, that appears in my consciousness, is a faithful copy of an external world. And when we think about that, that really is how we experience things. So when I'm looking at you right now, represented on my computer screen, I'm thinking, okay, that's what Amir looks like. Now I finally know what he looks like. And that's what his room looks like. But Yogacharans point out, all we're ever getting is the world as it shows up, mediated by our particular kind of sensory consciousness and sense organs. My dog, who's sitting right behind me, may look at this screen and have a completely different understanding of what's going on here. He's got different color vision. He hasn't learned to project pixels into people yet, and things like that. And so now if we were to ask the really dumb question, who sees the world correctly, me or my dog? We recognize how wrong that is. There's a world as it shows up for me and a world as it shows up for my dog. A different world as it shows up for different kinds of beings or for people with different sensory faculties. So the Yogacharan position is that the illusion is the illusion of the independence of our consciousness on the world and vice versa, whereas in fact we have a non-dual total immersion in the world. And the sense in which it's mind only is the sense in which the only thing we have access to is how the world shows up in our minds, not anything beyond that. So it's a slightly different project from Advaita Vedanta. They share, there's many overlaps and insights, but this one is focusing specifically on our experience, not on the nature of the world. And it's developing in the context of a Buddhist system in which mind and external world are empty of any intrinsic existence. Whereas for Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is anything but empty. It's the fullness of existence. And so there's a fundamental difference in the mode of existence of Brahman and Maya. So I wanted to start out by kind of drawing that set of distinctions so that things make sense. And so I guess what I would say is, yes, the Madhayamaka position is a different one from the Vedanta position. And from the Madhayamaka position, we're setting ourselves up for trouble in Vedanta, because we're setting ourselves up to deprecate the status of the actual empirical world that we live in, to not take it seriously enough, and to take our inner existence too seriously. And so to draw this massive distinction between consciousness and everything else. And that leads us to a kind of attachment to our conscious states, to the view that we're kind of immediately involved with them. And the deprecation of the external world is something that we can just kind of let go of and not think about too much. And a lot of Buddhists worry that what that will do is lead to a lack of ethical consciousness, because we fail to see ourselves as actually connected to the people around us, actually connected to the environment around us, and are able to say, that's just an illusion. Let's get to the important stuff. That's Brahman.
Yeah. So if I can circle back to that in a moment, I have something to ask about that. But just to drop in that question again, it seems to me, unless I've misunderstood, all three schools agree that there's no personal inherent self that's separate from an
Bingo.
external world in some way.
Yeah.
But you're saying there's the danger in some views of a reduction in empathy for the suffering or existence of other experiences, even though if there's no separate individual self over there, there is an experience, there is suffering, and a more complete understanding would evolve an empathy for that experience.
That's right. And the term that is used in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition is that that's the phenomenon of negating too much. It's one thing to say of my good friends that they don't exist intrinsically, that they aren't selves, that they're persons. It's another thing to say they don't actually exist at all, and they're not worth worrying about.
Mm.
Mm,
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, total sense.
Yeah.
It could, like most, well, I don't know most, probably like many people in the modern age, where I haven't uh, developed my thinking within a strict lineage or school. There's been a mishmash of teachers and different YouTube videos and, who
Mhm.
knows what else in my own exploration. Um, the flavor of the reason I've keep switching terms is because I'd normally call it non-duality, but you said all schools have non-duality. So maybe I'll park this question and just check.
Yeah,
I understand non-duality in well, I have my understanding of non-duality in the Advaita sense is there's no, it appears like things appear to consciousness, but they're
yeah,
one.
that's right.
What does it mean in the Prasangika or Madhyamaka context?
Good. In the Madhyamaka context, what it means is, well, really two things. On the metaphysical level, it means that we as thinkers, we as agents, we as perceivers, don't stand outside of the world looking at it, acting on it, thinking about it, but rather we're simply part of the world. And so that when I'm thinking about, when I'm perceiving you, the apparent duality, which really is there, that here I am, and then I've got this kind of, and that you exist only as my object, is falsified by the fact that the Amir I'm seeing is an Amir represented in my consciousness, and that my seeing involves a complicated causal interaction between us, mediated by the internet and various bits of software and things like that, but that there's not a fundamental ontological difference between us. I'm no realer than you are. So that's the metaphysical end of the non-duality, that we're all part of the same dependently originated manifold of interdependent phenomena. The, the phenomenological side of that is one that takes us closer now to the insights of Advaita. And that is that when I experience you, I experience a duality of subject and object. So what I experience is immediacy with respect to my own self-knowledge, but mediation with respect to my knowledge of you. And I experience you as existing outside, the you that I perceive as existing outside of my consciousness, and that I'm just registering you as you are. And what I'm forgetting is that what's going on now is the Amir who of whom I'm aware is one that's constructed in my brain in response to our conversation and auditory stimulation, the video stimulation from my screen, the way my nerves work, the way my eyes work, the way my ears work. And so what I'm experiencing is obviously an experience, which I'm confusing with a direct registering of somebody outside of me. And so there's a non-duality in my experience that I don't always notice, or even maybe sometimes ever notice, and replace it with a duality. And so Yogacara argues that we can cultivate a deeper appreciation and understanding of our own experience by appreciating that non-duality.
So to come back to the what I was saying earlier, my personal experience of contemplating and deepening into this idea of which might not be exactly Indian Advaita and it might not be exactly the other flavors, but my understanding of it has been okay, existence is a movement in a greater mind, and the subject that I am is that same subject. Henceforth, the experience that you're having, as I deepened into that way of looking, let's say,
Mhm.
the experience that you're having and the experience that people in Gaza are having and the people in other places are having are my experiences. And so my personal evolution with that was an increase in empathy. It wasn't the danger that you were pointing out didn't seem to come about in this instance, although I can see
Right.
how I have met people who have taken that route of like, well, it's all just illusion and they don't even take care of their own bodies as they might have otherwise.
Right.
But um, yeah, so just wondering if you have a comment or reflection on.
No, I think that's a good thing. I think that all of these traditions are in fact capable, if handled with the right deal of care, in making us better people, reducing our suffering and improving us as agents to reduce suffering. So I'm not personally, in deprecating the Advaita Vedanta tradition. Hell, I work on that tradition and have enormous respect for colleagues there. Or elevating the Buddhist tradition over it. I was only sort of talking about how canonically Buddhists would say, yeah, we're similar to those guys in these respects, but here's what we worry about, right? And from the Buddhist perspective, the worry in Advaita is always that it deprecates the conventional and reifies an ultimate mind. I mean, the other is a metaphysical issue, right? And that is that Buddhists really don't think it makes sense to talk about a single ultimate mind because they think that that occludes the tremendous difference between the perspectives of individual sentient beings in the world. And that it's hard to make sense of that. Now that's, that is a fight that Vedantins and Buddhists have been having for the last roughly 2,000 years. But the Buddhists always say, yeah. The Vedantins get Anatman right on the personal level, but then they get it wrong on the cosmic level. And they and the Vedantins say, yeah, but don't you think there's these Buddhas? And the Buddhists say, yeah, but we just think they're ordinary sentient beings who have accomplished a lot, not that we're all identical to one of them. So you get fights going back and forth that
Uh-huh. And the concern from the Buddhist side is mainly an ethical one of, okay, the danger of that view is that it can end up with uh, less ethical perspectives or less ethical behavior potentially.
Yeah, that's the big one. That's the bottom line. I mean, they're pointing out that it gets there because of a metaphysical mistake. So there's also a metaphysical issue, but the real concern here is ethical.
And is the claim on that side that it is a metaphysical mistake and there's some kind of that can be
Yeah,
proven in some way?
yeah, absolutely. Because it requires, from the Buddhist standpoint, when we start really talking about Brahman, we've got to give Brahman two contradictory qualities. One quality,
And just to check, can we say Brahman is synonymous with what in English we might say ultimate consciousness or
yes,
yeah,
yes,
okay,
exactly. Yeah, that's just the Sanskrit term for the ultimate
great.
consciousness.
Okay, just to make
We could just do it in English and talk about ultimate consciousness.
great.
Which makes it easier, right? Um,
Just want if this ends up being released and people watch it who are less familiar with Sanskrit terms, then that's
yeah,
great.
yeah, there's no reason why everybody should have to know Sanskrit terms. Um, Probably it's a good idea not to. Um, as my friend Richard Hayes, who's a great Sanskritist, once said, anybody smart enough to learn Sanskrit should be too smart to waste their life learning Sanskrit. um, he was joking, of course, but anyway, so fundamental cosmic consciousness. The Buddhists argue that to take it seriously, you're giving it simultaneously two contradictory properties. One is the property of being an unchangeable, completely substantially real, independent, and indescribable unity. And the second is saying, oh, yes, but in manifesting, it manifests in time and constantly changing and subject to causes and conditions and in multiplicity. And by the way, when we say that Brahman is indescribable, but is also the same as all these describable phenomena, hey, we're also describing it and contradicting ourselves. And so the Buddhists say that you're trying to have a particular kind of cosmic cake and eat it bit by bit too. Namely, you're trying to have its kind of unity and immutability, but also its manifestation in particularity and change, which underlies its unity and immutability. And they argue that that's just a deep metaphysical confusion. Either decide that you're in a complex interdependent world or decide that you're in a single unity. But if you decide that one, then you'd better not posit any real change. You better not posit distinction between sentient beings and so forth. And if you want this one, then you've got to get rid of intrinsic reality of everything, including Brahman.
So this is perfect because you've set me up to ask a question that I've been wanting to hear the Buddhist perspective talk about for a long time. Because I'm sure you're familiar with the metaphor of gold and jewelry or waves and water, in which, and again, just I know that you know this, but just so anyone listening can
Sure.
very briefly follow along, water, if I've understood it, water is used as a metaphor for obviously waves need water to exist, but water can continue to exist even when waves subside.
Yeah.
And so we can think of waves as an excitation of water, and water can take on many different configurations and many different patterns, but at no point is it anything other than water. So it's used as a metaphor for, okay, how can something be unchanging yet appear as so much change? The metaphor is waves and water, of like, well, the water aspect of it, the consciousness aspect, that's always there, unchanging. Nothing's really happened to the waterness of water, yet its movement shows up as waves, which at no point affect how much or how little or how watery the water is. So I'm sure this has come up in these debates before, but I haven't yet heard it addressed. So I'd love for you to do that now. Um, and maybe to also just pin in case it's relevant, in the last conversation we had, and I don't know if this has been part of the Buddhist debate, but or if it's personal to you, you were saying you're very comfortable with contradiction, that paradox is kind of allowed in your worldview. So it might be two different answers, your answer being comfortable with contradiction, and the Buddhist one, which sounded like, well, we're not comfortable with that contradiction. You're kind of trying to say two things. It doesn't change, and yet it clearly does.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Lots of questions there. Do me a favor. If I manage to lose track of one and forget, you keep me honest.
I'll do my best.
The first one is about the water and waves metaphor. And like almost every important metaphor in the Indian philosophical tradition, the fun thing is that it appears both in Buddhist and non-Buddhist schools to make different points. And I'm just kind of footnoting that one because it occurs in the Yogacara school as an analysis of how thought occurs in consciousness. But you're right, in the Advaita Vedanta school, it's making a very different point. The Buddhists respond to that this way. They say, yes, you can take that metaphor of water as some kind of an ontological basis of the things that occur in it. But that basis, because things occurs in it, is in fact constantly changing. So it's now water with one set of properties, now water with another set of properties. And Buddhists are kind of early believers in Leibniz's law, that is the identity of indiscernibles and the indiscernibility of identicals. So the view that if two things are identical, of course, then they're one thing, if and only if they share all of their properties, right? So, for instance, if we think about what we call identical twins, they're not literally identical. There are two of them, right? One of them is a few minutes older than another one. One of them is sitting to the left and the other one sitting to the right. And because they have different properties, they are different. They're different individuals. But then we can talk about identity that is much stronger than that, what I'd call real identity. So that if we say, His Majesty King Charles is the monarch of the United Kingdom, we're not saying he's a lot like the monarch of the United Kingdom, that he looks just like the monarch of the United Kingdom, but that they're really just two names for the same thing. With identical twins, there are two things that share a lot of properties. With monarchs and the person who instantiates that, there's one thing described in two different ways. Now, the Buddhists point out that in order to get that kind of unity and identity that you want out of Brahman, what you have to have is all the successive stages and manifestations of Brahman being identical to one another. They're not. They're similar, just as waves, the water without the waves is similar to water that's chopped up with waves. They're different moments of that water. And the difference is what you have to attend to. So what you lose is the indivisibility of Brahman. You lose the unity because the Brahman you've now got now is a changing Brahman. It's kind of what you might think of as a committee or a succession of Brahmans, and that's not what you wanted. So that's how Buddhists respond to that deployment of that example. Interestingly, when you see Yogacharan Buddhists deploy that same example, and they talk about our kind of fundamental levels of consciousness being like the water, that are so deep that we can't see the bottom. But then when it's stirred by wind, waves appear and we become aware of the waves. Those are our thoughts. They're not saying that that deep ocean is not changing. They're saying that that deep ocean, or unconscious mind, isn't accessible to introspection. But only when things get stirred up do we start thinking about what we're thinking and who we are. So it's a kind of very different use of that same metaphor. Now, you also pointed out that I'm somebody who's comfortable with contradictions, and a lot of Indian philosophers, including a lot of Buddhist philosophers, are not. Now, footnote, some Buddhist philosophers are very comfortable with contradictions, and some aren't. So Nagarjuna.
Throughout history, or is that more a modern phenomenon?
Yeah, especially from about the 1st century or BC on. So that when you look at classical Buddhist thought, I want to use these two terms very carefully: classical Buddhist logic and medieval Buddhist logic. Classical Buddhist logic is structured by what's called, I'm going to use one Sanskrit term and then I will define it, what's called the Chatuskoti, or 4 corners. So it's a kind of lattice structure, like if people know a little bit of topology, it's like a Haas diagram of a diamond. So that we've got the truest thing is just things that are just true. We've also got things that are just false, but we've got things that are true and false, and things that are neither true nor false. And so whenever Buddhists try to go in this classical period, try to understand the possible positions that we might need to consider, they always consider the possibility that a position is correct, that it's incorrect, both and neither, or that, say, things exist, don't exist, both or neither. That same kind of representation of logical space, again, a footnote, is the one that gets used in contemporary relevant logics and paraconsistent logics. And those are often the ones used in computer database reasoning. So weirdly, that classical Indian philosophy was rejuvenated in the middle of the 20th century and has become very influential in the 21st century.
Does the classical predate the medieval, or the other way around?
Yeah. So now we're talking 1st, 2nd century. But then what happens? Around the 3rd, 4th century, Buddhists and non-Buddhists are involved in a lot of productive interchange, and they need kind of rules of the road for debate. And Indian philosophers kind of decide that the rules for the road for debate are the Nyaya logic, which Nyaya was one of the orthodox schools. And that's a school that does not tolerate contradiction at all. It's a categorical logic that's very consistent. And that gets taken up in the Buddhist world by the people often called the logicians. I prefer epistemologists, the epistemological school of Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and their followers. And that becomes dominant through medieval Buddhism, kind of till the end of Buddhism in India. So we're talking from about the 3rd or 4th century to about the 9th or 10th century. And that's the logic that kind of moves into Tibet. That earlier paradox tolerating logic, though, gets carried off into China, where when Taoists, who were also big believers in paradox and contradiction, saw it, they said, wow, we know how to talk to you guys. And so when you look at the Chan tradition or the Zen tradition, you see a certain love of paradox that you don't find in the South Asian tradition and the Central Asian tradition. A group of us wrote a book about this recently, by the way. I'll try to sell the book now, called What Can't Be Said, Paradox and Contradiction in East Asian Thought. And it sort of talks about this history of the embrace of contradiction and paradox. Having said all of that, though, I want to come back to your original question.
Just so I can like piece together another part of the puzzle of history, Tsongkhapa and Prasangika, they're accepting contradiction or they're not?
Tsongkhapa does not. Does
Okay.
not at all. Nagarjuna, who Tsongkhapa takes himself to be following, I think was acceptance of the possibility of
Okay.
contradiction.
Interesting.
He uses
Right.
the Catuskoti all the time. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So yeah, carry on with
But
what you were about to say.
Tsongkhapa doesn't like contradictions. That's not to say he isn't committed to them, but he would be bothered by that fact. But then if we get to somebody like Mikya Dorje or Wangchuk Dorje, Tibetan philosophers in the Kagyu tradition, who are following the Indian Mahamudra tradition, coming after Tsongkhapa, they are very happy with contradictions, very happy with paradox. So both of those strains we find in Tibetan thought, largely depending on how much people like the Dharmakirti and Dignaga logic. Tsongkhapa likes it a lot, says no contradictions. Mikya Dorje, Wangchuk Dorje, Mipa Rinpoche, they really don't like it, think it was a mistake, and they kind of go back to the earlier view. So that's still around.
Yeah,
But
sorry, I interrupted what you were
no,
about to
that's
say.
fine. That's fine. I just didn't want to try to lose all of these great questions. So the last one I think I had to come to is this one. When classical and medieval Indian philosophers are engaging with Vedanta and accuse it with a contradictory understanding of Brahman, you could understand the rhetorical force of that accusation in two different ways. One is a lot of these guys were people who had already rejected the idea of contradictions being true. But sometimes you yourself might think contradictions can be true, but your opponent in an argument doesn't. So you want to say to them, look, you can't accept your own position because, look, I'm going to show you your position commits you to contradictions. And you say there are no contradictions. So even though, like, I'd be kind of happy with that, you shouldn't accept that because of your logical principles. And I think the latter is what's often happening in these debates because they're debating with people who have a consistent logic. They say, look, if you really want to be consistent, you can't maintain this position.
Mhm. And so just again, from my more or less naive view, it doesn't seem troubling. And I think I probably intuitively prefer consistency and non-contradiction, but
Oh, you'll
maybe,
get over it.
yeah, yeah, maybe things will change very soon.
Yeah.
I'm very inconsistent in other areas of my life, but let's find out. Um, it doesn't bother me to think, again, if I come back to that water wave analogy, to say, okay, there's an aspect of reality that never changes, and there's an aspect that does, and similar to water and wave, and it is just a metaphor, it doesn't map on exactly
Yeah.
to reality,
Right.
but it can help me scaffold to like, oh, well, maybe reality similarly um, is non-dual. Clearly, water isn't separate from waves. You can't take the wave out of the water. You can't take the movements of consciousness, which you could consider all kinds of thought or all kind of like a dream, out of its substrate. Yet the dreamness aspect, the kind of fundamental aspect of it, never changes, and yet it's full of change. And that apparent paradox I'm comfortable with if I lean on that metaphor of water and wave.
Yeah. To do that, though, I'm sort of taking the Buddhist side on this one now to keep the
Sure.
debate going.
Yeah, sure.
To do that, you have to ignore relational properties. Because no matter what you say about properties that remain the same, as long as you're in a domain of change, relational properties are going to constantly change. So
Yes.
that things get older. It's now the water that was once that wave. Now it's the water that was once both of those waves. And so once you introduce relational properties, then you're in trouble. And so then it turns out that things really do, since they have different attributes, different properties at different times, they're different things. That's why Buddhists will argue, for instance, this is getting back to our beginning at no self, that when we try to think of ourselves as selves, what we're grabbing onto is an unchanging core. But even if we thought that it didn't change in any other respect, we can say that there was a time, we think I've got a self, that was the self of a 5-year-old, and now it's the self of a 70-year-old. So to be the self of a 5-year-old or to be the self of a 70-year-old, those are different properties. So the same thing can't be both of those. So it's actually not the same thing, but a causal descendant of that earlier thing. And so you could say the same thing about a substratum of waves or a substratum of consciousness. The moment you make room, the Buddhists will say, for the evolution of consciousness, then the substratum itself is constantly evolving in terms at least of its relational properties.
Mm-hmm. It could be I haven't understood you, but it feels to me I can agree with that and still sense there's something in the water aspect of the water which is constantly waving that is just water. Like
Yeah,
if I honed in on what about the water has changed, well, its movement has changed and it never stops changing. Um,
right. And that's to say that that water that's moving, this is the Buddhist point, that that bit of water that's moving, any of it, is not the water that it was a moment ago.
mhm,
It's different because its properties have changed. And
mhm,
so the Buddhists are leaning very heavily on the importance of impermanence and temporality to
mhm,
say that once you appreciate the reality of impermanence, then you recognize that change is always change in identity.
mhm. Okay.
Similarity is retained, of course, and causal
What is
connected
retained?
similarity, that
Mhm,
is, and causal connectedness is there. But what we're seeing is a sequence of similar causally connected events and phenomena, not
mhm,
a single substratum that gets different properties at different times without itself changing. Because to have different properties at different times is to change.
And then this is hearsay now. This is not something I've understood or experienced. But I have physicist friends who tell me time is in question, and I
Yeah,
have Buddhist meditation friends, meditator friends, who say, okay, in deep meditation, you might have an insight which calls into question the nature of time, which I imagine would call into question the nature of change, because I
yeah,
imagine change and time are required. So, um, was that is that relevant to what you're saying here, which is
yeah.
the the negation of a substrate of consciousness that has an aspect to it that never changes is negated through this idea of, well, there's constant change. But if time is negated, does that argument fall down, or is there a different argument that comes up to replace it? Or
Oh, no, it doesn't fall down at all. In fact, Nagarjuna considers this quite explicitly in his fundamental verses on the middle way, Mula Madhyamaka Paraka, when he argues for the emptiness of time. He says, here's what you don't want to do. You don't want to think of time um, as an independent phenomenon that's prior to objects and is the container of events like the Newtonian scheme. Um, Rather, you can only think of time as a system of relations between phenomena. Um, and that's, of course, what we're discovering as we look at the way that time is emergent in general relativity and quantum gravity.
Mhm,
Carlo Rovelli's work on that is really especially nice, and he ties it explicitly to the Buddhist analyses.
mhm. Okay, great.
So
Just
that's to say that not even time is permanent. And you can say, well, gee, who would have thought so? Well, the answer is, say, Newton and most of us intuitively. But when you recognize to say, well, time is permanent, you realize immediately how stupid that was, because that would mean it existed for all time, but now you've got a different time in which time is existing and you're off on a regress. Whereas if you say time is impermanent, then you seem to mean that it's changing in time, which doesn't make any sense. So time is neither impermanent nor permanent. Well, time isn't the kind of thing to exist then, since anything that exists is either permanent or impermanent. So existence is the wrong way to think about time. Instead, think of it as a structure of relations. But it's that structure of relations in virtue of which everything in time is impermanent.
and that's how to think about all phenomena, right?
Yeah,
From yeah.
from a Buddhist perspective, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I can tell, I think when I listen back to this conversation, some of this will start to filter in. It's it's funny because I used to think of understanding as something that once I get it, I've got it. I used to be a dancer, um, but I've realized it's much more like dancing, where I might get a move one day and then it's gone the next. But
Yeah,
it's a bit easier to find it again, and I can feel like the clouds parting in my mind just briefly. Like, oh, I
that's a
think I
perfect
might one day understand this.
That's
Yeah,
a perfect metaphor. And also, like dancing, I think that it's both cognitive and somatic at the same time,
yeah,
um, and requires a certain kind of spontaneity to manifest. As
mm,
long as it's labored, it's not what you want. It's only
mm,
when it becomes spontaneous and part of you that it's real understanding. That takes
yeah.
time.
Um, so I have a few more questions, if that's okay. I don't know how you
Sure.
are for time today, and
I'm nicely unconstrained right now.
leisurely. Okay. Well, in that case, I'll ask a more personal question, which I'm fairly confident comes up for more people than just me, which is um, this is challenging.
Yeah.
Uh, like dancing, it's hard, and I grapple with these ideas and feel like I sometimes almost get them, and then I'll find someone who appears to me much more. Um, I think it's fair to say probably more intelligent, but certainly more has spent more time and more years investigating, who totally disagrees with the view that I'm just starting to understand.
Mhm.
And similar to what you said at the beginning, well, I have two motivations. One, it's kind of fun to think, so sometimes it is entertainment, granted,
Yeah.
but also it has at times seemed like a route to suffer less, hopefully cause less harm, maybe increase well-being and flourishing in life, etc. But it's one of many directions that I could put my efforts in life in. Like, let's say maybe I live 80 years. Where do I put my energy? Um, it feels like I could easily keep at just this subject for a lifetime of like, okay, who's got it more right, the Advaitans or the Buddhists? And
Mhm.
you know, do you have any general comments on not everyone's going to, including myself, probably not going to become a professional philosopher. I'm going to
Good.
do my best. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
want to have a good life, reduce suffering for myself and others, um, and increase well-being. Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
have any?
I think that's a wonderful question. I want to come at it in two different ways. I mean, one is, um, should everybody be a philosopher? And of course, the answer is no. And I want to talk about why not, beyond the obvious. Um, and the second question, though, is, can philosophical reflection be helpful to everybody? And I think the answer to that is very different. I think the answer to that is yes. Um, the thing about human beings, we are what I call elsewhere the hypersocial great ape. And by hypersocial, I don't just mean that we're really, really social, like more social than chimpanzees or bonobos, but I mean that we're the ape that really actively constructs its own social niche. And then that niche actively shapes us to continue constructing that niche. There's this wonderful feedback between our social nature and the societies we create. And then, of course, only people with a really great social nature will make it in those societies that become more social, and we get this hyper-social spiral. Um, because of that, we end up creating very complicated societies. And very complicated societies need massive collective skill sets. And massive collective skill sets, when you've got finite beings with only so much time to learn and only certain abilities and talents, mean that there's got to be specialization. Some people are heart surgeons, and some people are psychiatrists. Some people are plumbers, and some people are electricians. And some people are philosophers, and some are historians, and some are artists, and some are art critics. And you just need all of those roles. And most of them are difficult enough that you need to devote a lifetime to them to become really good at them, and also to be able to do the other thing that's our job, which is to train the next generation to do them too, so that things don't crumble when we're gone. Um, so some people are inclined to philosophy as a vocation, and some people are not. Fortunately, very few are, because You don't need that many philosophers, actually. Some people are inclined to plumbing as a vocation and attracted to it, and fortunately not everybody is, or there would be too many plumbers and nobody would make any money being a plumber, right? So we need to have just the right number of people in society to meet the needs, and not everybody has to be a philosopher. I think that's fine. On the other hand, philosophy is one of those fruits of our highly sophisticated hypersocial life that enables human reflection and enables us to use thought and conversation, two things we're really good at, to become better human beings, to become happier, and to feed back ideas for happiness into society. And that means that anybody, whether we're a heart surgeon or a plumber or an artist or a poet or a philosopher or a mathematician, anybody is capable of thinking about what it is to be human, of what it is to lead a good life, and capable by thinking about that to actually become better human beings and to lead better lives. I really believe that. I think that philosophical reflection can be a useful ingredient in everybody's life, just as exercise can be, just as appreciation of the arts can be, just as political engagement can be. Each of these is important for different reasons, but philosophy's in that mix. So my hope is that the things that people like me who teach and who write and think about philosophy do, my hope is always that what we do gets out of our study into the public domain and is useful to people who aren't doing just what we do. Just as if you had a whole bunch of plumbers, none of whom did any work on anything but stuff owned by other plumbers, then you'd have a lot of people whose houses wouldn't work real well and some very poor plumbers. Same thing is true of philosophers. If other people don't, listen to us, then you're going to have a very unreflective society and people who have wasted their lives. So, what we're doing right now, for instance, talking in a format that is intended for anybody, not just professional philosophers, is a useful kind of thing to do. And I think it's important for philosophy to be articulated in a way that enables people to appreciate it. I'd say the same thing for art, for poetry, for music, and plumbing. And right, it should be these all should be beneficial, not just to the experts and the practitioners, but to the world as a whole. That's why we specialize.
Yeah.
And so the gift that I've been given, which is a huge gift, of a life that I've been able to spend thinking about philosophy, teaching philosophy, writing philosophy, comes with the obligation to try to make some of that reflection and teaching and writing beneficial to people who aren't just philosophers. Otherwise, I'm kind of a freeloader.
Well, I very much appreciate this conversation with you. And as I mentioned in an email to you, I had been more familiar with Advaita teachings, and then through contact with Buddhist friends, have been exposed more to these emptiness teachings, and then through your course and the course that you recommended with Guy Newman. I did discover as I contemplated how things only, to my level, only exist in relation to other things. There's no essence there. I did find, not universally and not at all times, but there were occasions where I felt more forgiving towards someone because I saw them as less intrinsically the way my immediate judgment might have characterized them, or I was less upset by a certain circumstance because I saw it as transient and not inherently existing and dependent on so many other circumstances. So just to kind of slot that in as a piece of gratitude and in a way,
Isn't that a nice thing? Isn't that a
well,
nice?
amazing thing, yeah.
And what you just said was maybe the most important thing. I just want to pause and draw attention to that. You said gratitude. I think one of the really cool things about noticing interdependence is that it allows us to put down pride and replace it with gratitude. And to recognize that anything that we understand or accomplish is because somebody else figured that out and taught it to us or helped us develop the skills to do that.
Mm.
And that's true whether it's, a sports performance or a musical performance or an idea that we understand or whatever, right? I mean, that's really cool. And I like the fact that you use that with gratitude. Thank you.
Yeah, very much. Um, and it's just this amazing time now where so many teachings are available on YouTube, along with almost infinite distraction.
Yeah.
But, but yeah, we do what we can to keep the ratings on these videos high. Um, okay, so if it's okay, I'll ask you some more questions on uh, where Advaita and the view on Buddhism that you represent overlaps.
Mhm.
Um, wh- and maybe I'll give my, again, very brief recapitulation of what I understood from your and Guy's courses,
Mhm.
which is things only, th to say things are empty is to say they're empty of inherent existence.
Mhm.
And the only way things exist are dependent on their parts,
Mhm.
dependent on causes and conditions,
Mhm.
dependent on designation or imputation.
Yeah.
And to take this chair that I'm sitting on as an example, it's a wooden chair. Uh, it it doesn't exist independently from its legs and its base, so it depends on its parts. Um, the reason I know you know all this, I'm just saying it so you can
Right.
correct if
It's
there's a gross
always good
misunderstanding.
for me to hear it again.
Okay. Uh, there's certain causes of its existence. Someone had to cut down a tree, someone had to cut it up, had to fashion it into a chair. It wouldn't exist in this room without the room, so there's causes and conditions to its existence. And then importantly and more subtly, it requires humans to invent this concept called chair as objects we sit on and designate this as being an object that we sit on versus something that we, I don't know, for a termite, it would be food. And for an elephant, it would be at best a footstool. So
Mhm.
it exists um, dependent on those three conditions.
Mhm.
And if I understood everything exists dependent on those three conditions,
Mhm.
and then to get to my point and question, so it sounds like everything, and this is where I might be garbling and mashing the teachings, because everything exists dependent partly on imputation, nothing exists outside of a conscious act or happening. I know you didn't like the
Oh,
word consciousness,
right.
trying to find a way of phrasing it without saying consciousness. It requires a perception for things to exist. Is that
Um,
close, or have I then taken the teachings
it's
and gone off on a
very,
totally?
it's very close, right up until I mean, it's all right up to the very end. And
Yeah.
the inference that because conceptual imputation is an important condition for the existence of entities, it doesn't follow that an entity exists only so long as it's being imputed. What it means is that when we take something to be a thing of a particular kind, that's because of our imputation. So it's a different dimension of interdependence. And you might call it the ontic dimension, the dimension in which things come to exist as things because they have to exist as something of a kind, and the kinds begin with us. But it doesn't mean that if you turn out the lights and everybody leaves your room, the chair pops out of existence. Because what we have there is something that is of the kind that we've designated as a chair. I don't need to go around designating each chair. But for any of those to exist as a chair, there has to have been a kind designated.
So the feeling of the chair exists only when I'm
Yeah,
feeling it, right?
yeah,
The,
absolutely.
the
Unless
colors
somebody
of the
else.
chair exist when I'm perceiving them.
Yeah.
What about the chair? And again, maybe I don't know if your view, personal view, maps on 100% to Prasangika. So maybe I should be asking,
In this respect, it does. In this
okay,
respect, it does.
yeah. So in the Prasangika view, what about the chair continues to exist when I leave the room and no one's thinking about this chair?
Well, remember, um, the entire representation of the world we have is a representation of interdependent things and things of kinds. And when we designate something as a chair, we're designating it as a chair because we think it's the kind of thing that doesn't just exist for a few moments, right? But it's going to keep existing and be there when we come back, right? And that was there all along, so that if somebody said, hey, where is there a chair? You could have said, there's one up in my study, and you would have been right. I mean, imagine two different furniture stores, okay? Um, so we've got, the Madhayamaka furniture store on one corner and the Vedanta furniture, that's not even fair because Vedantins don't believe this. But
You get them half price at the Vedanta store.
yeah, the Berkeley Idealist furniture store. And it's the Prasangika furniture store, you say they sell these great chairs because these chairs, they guarantee are going to hang around even when you're not there. But the Berkeley store sells you a different chair. It tells you a chair that pops into existence the moment you look at it and disappears from existence when you turn your back, right? Now, the curious thing, of course, is that in your ordinary life, you won't be able to tell which store the furniture came from because it's kind of like the refrigerator problem, right? But if you ask exactly what do we take chairs to be, the answer is we take them to be the kind we buy at the Madhayamaka store, not to be the kind of thing we buy at the Berkeley store, right? I mean, again, that's despite the fact that if I gave you two chairs, one of which was a Berkeley chair and one a Madhayamaka chair, nobody would ever be able to tell the difference between the two, which is pretty weird.
Yeah, like well, wouldn't say I'm 100% comfortable with it, but I've contemplated a lot to the point where I now, if I was to leave the room and no one was, it's that old tree in the forest thing, I'd have to again, if someone said the chair exists, continues to exist when no one's
Yeah.
experiencing it, I'd have to ask, well, what do you mean?
Well,
Like, what
here's what
about
they
it
might mean.
exists?
Here's what they might mean. It's still exerting the same gravitational field. It's got the same mass that it does, the same location, the same, all the same properties. And here's what they might say. Part of what we think about the world, part of what we think is conventionally true about the world, and that's the only kind of truth we have, are the truths of physics and chemistry. And if you thought that it was a Berkeley chair, you'd have to explain how physically and chemically it disappeared and reconstituted all the time. And we don't have any theories that make sense of that. Dependent origination is not a case by case thing. We don't sort of think about a chair, then we think about the piano, then we think about the table. Now let's think about the book. We're thinking about, as I said, an entire ensemble that's physically and cognitively connected. And it's hard to make sense of that ensemble on the Berkeleyan view. Now, if you said, well, hard to make sense of it, but guess what? That's right. Because think about what the world would look like to you that way, and it looks to you, and there's no difference. We want to say right, but our ability to explain things would fall apart completely. And dependent origination is about explicability.
I think that's where the this analytical idealism view that Bernardo was proposing, which I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if it's the same as Berkeley or other philosophers, um, where what exists independently from me is other movements in subjectivity, which
Mm-hmm.
appear so in the same way, like if I was to turn off this screen,
Mm-hmm.
I would get that um, these pixels that appear as J would
Mm-hmm.
disappear, and like they
Yeah.
really have gone.
Yeah.
But the subjectivity that we call J, which is dependent and there is
Mhm.
no like essence there, that
Right.
would continue to exist without me experiencing
Absolutely. I
reflections
promise you
of
it
itself
does.
on my screen. Um, so again, I don't know Berkeley, but from the idealist view that I've understood, the chair would continue to exist as a subjective movement in the mind of universal consciousness or mind at large or whatever, but it wouldn't exist as a set of like chemistry is how it shows up when measured as a particular way, in the same way that you show up on my Zoom screen in this
Yeah,
way, but to your dog, you'd show up as mainly as a collection of cloud of smells, and to
yeah.
so does that address that apparent problem of
I don't think so. Because what it doesn't address is the kind of network of explicability that we expect from conventional reality. So notice that if you take that kind of, I'll call it a neo-Vedantin or crypto-Vedantin idealistic route, then you have to not only do all the physics and chemistry, but you have to explain why the laws of physics and chemistry predict that chairs remain where they are and don't decompose that much. And indeed, they do, but that they don't predict that they disappear and then reappear, and we can't figure out how to do chemistry and physics in a way consistent with that. One of the things that personally attracts me about the Buddhist philosophical view is this naturalism it has, right? This idea that it takes the deliverances of nature, I mean, like the sort of deliverance of science or picture of nature, to be roughly correct, right? And not to be itself something that we leave aside. So when we talk about causal dependent origination, we're talking about dependent origination as the sciences understand it, right?
Hmm.
There's a reason why when we plant a mango seed, we get a mango tree, and when we plant a barley seed, we get barley. And there's a whole network of science that explains that, and that whole network of science predicts that chairs stay put when we close the door, and leave the room. And you'd have to give up a lot of explanatory power, a lot of that cohesion that makes sense of dependent origination, if you take the strong idealist view.
No, yeah, and here we'll bump up against the limits of my understanding, but in my understanding, we don't have to lose the ability of science to make observations, create frameworks called theories that observe the patterns of the behavior of what we observe, and then make predictions. Um, in the same way that we can observe certain patterns in, let's say, if we just take something that is pure mind, which is like my emotions and my thoughts, I can
Yeah,
observe the certain patterns that
yeah,
continue. Whereas if I think about all the horrible things that someone said to me, I will fairly consistently start to feel negative emotions towards them. So there's certain patterns there that I can see, and there might be the same things that happen out in nature that are just outside of human minds or cognition that are much more consistent than that they happen on much longer timescales, and we call those
mm,
physics and we call those chemistry and whatever.
yeah,
But in essence, what they are when they're not being observed, when they're not being represented on the dashboard of my perception,
mm,
um, is a form of subjectivity in the same way that your thoughts don't
yeah.
exist as physical entities, unless you think they do. Uh, d-
Well, I think that we explain them, both cognitively and physically, and they certainly have physical substrates. Um,
the thoughts do?
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's what nervous systems are about, and societies and languages that enable those thoughts. And yeah, um, I think that a thoroughgoing naturalism is the best way to make sense of the world. So you're right that you could imagine having a kind of transcendent psychology that explained not only the regularities of our moods, but why chairs pop in and out of existence. But then I would just sort of say, okay, let's put the money on the table. Are you going to bet on the deliverances of contemporary physical science or of a promised transcendent psychology for how you actually understand the world? Um, and, to put it even stronger, if you're trying to figure out how to build a bridge or an automobile or to do some surgery, do you want to rely on the science that we have, or to say, no, 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 I've got a better idea. In the future, we're going to have this transcendent psychology that will explain why things emerge only from consciousness. Don't do anything until then. I kind of think that there's so much good reason to be realistic about the science that we have. And that doesn't just mean having confidence in the observations. That means taking seriously the explanatory force. And the explanatory force of a theory according to which there are persistent, continuous physical objects is a hell of a lot better than the explanatory force of any idealistic psychology.
And as you know, the attraction to a lot of idealists is that it seems to bridge the hard problem or the explanatory gap between. So, because I remember in the last call you said you don't see the hard problem as a hard problem. So maybe could you say what you mean by physical, and maybe you could reiterate what you meant when you. I've done this several times, haven't I? Where I've kind of thrown three questions at you, but you've consistently done really well with answering all of them, and a fourth one that I didn't notice was there. Um, but I noticed you just said that you think your thoughts are underpinned by a physical substrate.
Yep.
So perhaps when you say what you mean by something being physical, you could say what you mean in that context. Because what I had understood from you in the last conversation was that you didn't feel the need to reduce everything
Right.
to like a lower substrate, that thought or financial transactions um, don't need to be reducible to.
That's right. Not
Yeah.
reducible. Not reducible.
Yeah.
So, and I think the idea of reduction is really crazy. But as I said, not reducible, but supervenient. And the supervenient space, I think, is important. So here's a way to make the point. I want you to imagine
Are
two.
you about to explain supervenience? Because I
I
don't know
am.
what that
I
means.
am.
Okay,
That's
great.
exactly what I'm about to do.
Okay,
I
perfect.
really want to draw that distinction. And then I'll be able to talk about the kind of naturalism that I think makes sense in a way that's a little bit more precise. And I can do this without it being very technical. Imagine two worlds, right? That's already weird, but let's just do it. The actual Earth and another Earth, right? And imagine that other Earth is molecule for molecule, event for event, moment by moment, identical to this Earth. So that if you were magically transported there, you couldn't even tell that you were on a different planet, right? Everything the same, everything. So they're the same physically. The same physical objects move about in the same places. If I hand a $1 note to a shopkeeper on Earth, then Twin J hands a $1 note to a shopkeeper on Twin Earth, and so forth. All we do is describe it physically. They're physically identical. Now I ask you a question. Do you think that they are financially identical? Do you think that if there's a fiscal deficit in the United States in one world, there's going to be a deficit in the United States in the other world? I think everybody would say, of course. I mean, if
Yeah.
you can't tell the difference, you can't, at the physical level, you can't tell the difference at that level. And then I say, all right, suppose there was a painting on this Earth that was really beautiful, say the Mona Lisa. Is it also beautiful on that Earth? Sure, nothing is different. So if it's beautiful here, it's beautiful there. If I'm thinking to myself on this Earth, the Mona Lisa is beautiful and the US is running a huge deficit, is Jay on that Earth thinking the Mona Lisa is beautiful and the United States is running a deficit? Yes, after all, he's saying the same things, everything's the same. Now, if you believe all of that, you believe in supervenience. You believe that two worlds that are identical globally physically are identical globally financially, identical globally psychologically. Now, that doesn't mean that in either of those worlds, we can reduce a psychological event or an economic event to physical events. So let's make that really clear. If we take the event of paying $1 for something, there are a lot of different ways to do that. I could hand a $1 bill to somebody. I could do an electronic funds transfer. I could write a check. I could handle 4 25-cent pieces to somebody. I could tell somebody, I promise you I'll pay you tomorrow. All kinds of things we can do. And those are very different physically. So if you asked physically, what is it to pay somebody $1? The answer is there is no physical redescription of that. Similarly, I think there's no physical redescription of what it is to believe that the earth is round. I think we can have that belief in many, many ways, or to believe that lasagna tastes good. I think we can believe that in many, many ways. But so I don't think there's a reduction of the psychological to the physical or of the economic to the physical. But what I do believe is that if you fix all the physical facts, you fix the psychological facts, and you have fixed the financial facts. And that's what we mean by supervenience. Now, it's important to see that supervenience, even if the supervenience goes in one direction, it does not follow at all, that makes what happens at the so-called higher levels, the supervening levels, non-existent or unimportant or explanatorily impotent. Because you could have important regularities and phenomena that go in both directions, right? And explanations that go in both directions. But it is to say that at an ontological level, we think that there is a kind of direction of supervenience, a direction in which fix these facts, you fix those facts. Note that fixing the economic facts wouldn't fix the physical facts, because there's so many different ways in which the same economic facts could be realized. So when I talk about a naturalism in the Buddhist worldview, that attracts me. It's the naturalism that says that we don't have to have two kinds of stuff, mind stuff and body stuff. We don't have to have, mysterious mental events and unmysterious physical events. And that the descriptions that our understanding of the way that things that are non-physical, like financial transactions or thoughts, are instantiated in physical systems doesn't involve any mystery. It sometimes might be, tricky to understand, but no big mystery. Because it's the big mystery, the so-called hard problem, comes from thinking that there are these completely ontologically autonomous psychological facts that are somehow connected to physical facts and no way to understand that. But just as every economic event has to be some kind of physical event, every kind of cognitive event has to be some kind of physical event. It's just that there's no single physical event that every kind of cognitive event is.
What's the physical event? Just so I follow. I get it if I give you some gold and you give me like a house, but what if I just say I'll pay you tomorrow?
Yeah, those are both ways of, and very good deals on buying a house. So so if I pay you with the $1 bill, the first thing to notice is my handing that $1 note to you. So I switched to American English. My handing that $1 note to you is not the entirety of that in which the transaction consists. There's a lot of other stuff too. There's the fact of that dollar was minted in the U.S. Mint and not drawn carefully in my basement. In which case I wasn't handing you a dollar, I was handing you a counterfeit dollar. There's the fact that the Federal Reserve continues to stand behind the US currency, at least for the next 2 days. There's the fact that we have a practice of, using paper currency as a way of purchasing and so forth. And if you do it by saying, don't worry, Jay, I'll pay you tomorrow, then that's supervening on a whole lot of different facts, right? Facts about, my views about your credibility, right? And maybe facts about your history. But in each case, there's this very broad supervenience space of lots of things that feed into that being
But the
purchased.
later one didn't sound so physical.
All physical, right?
But if I just say,
it's not physical, supervenient on physical. Again, in any two worlds where you have done exactly the same things in your past, you're going to be just as credible. And if part of what purchasing on an IOU is credibility, then it's supervening on all the stuff that you've done. When I decide I will take your word that you're going to pay me $1 tomorrow if I hand my house over today, then presumably I'm, reflecting upon your past behavior, not kind of looking into your soul, because all I've got is your past behavior. That's what gives you your credit rating.
And just hypothetically, if you are a very trusting person, or I just show up and I say, would you like my house?
Mm-hmm.
And you say, yeah. And I'm like, okay, you're now the owner of that house.
Mm-hmm. Even better
That,
deal.
yeah, it just keeps getting better. So, um, there's no obvious physical exchange
No, but
happening.
sounds have been made. You've said things. I've heard those sounds. Things have happened in my ears. Things have happened in my brain. Things happened in your brain. Moreover, all of this supervenes on the entirety of the English speaking world, because of course it's the way that words like house and you can have and so forth are used that make all of that. Again, fix all of those facts. That in any two worlds where you say, fine, you can have my house, I come to own your house.
So it sounds like an argument that requires there be a physical correlate for every thought.
Yeah.
So
Or an
if it,
ethical instantiation base, which
yeah,
might be vast. It doesn't identify thoughts with brain states. It identifies thoughts with whole, very large patterns of physical activity.
yeah,
Just like to identify a dollar note with being worth $1 requires you to talk about a whole lot more than ink and paper. You've got to think about mints and currencies and things like that. In each case, we don't say, my gosh, there's a hard problem about money. How is it that something that isn't intrinsically worth, there's less than $1 worth of paper and ink on that paper, but somehow it's worth $1? Or, even worse, there's exactly as much ink and paper in a $1 note and a $20 note, but one's worth 20 times as much as the other one. Now we have a hard problem, the hard problem of money, to figure out where that value is. No, no, no. We know exactly how to figure out where that value is. We talk about how economics works. And we presume that every economic phenomenon is physically instantiated in some complex way or other. And I think the same thing is true about thought, experience, sensation.
and if we were to discover some thoughts had no correlate in physical, observable physical universe, would that put a hole in
It
this
would, but
theory?
I don't know how you could possibly describe that. And I don't know anybody believes that, really. Because if you really do take that thought experiment with which we began and think of two physically completely identical worlds, and I said to you, but here's the difference. Somebody thinks something in this world and thinks something different in that world. You'd be really puzzled, right? I mean, it wouldn't have any physical, there would be no difference in causes, no difference in effects. Everybody would say exactly the same thing. What possible reason could you have to believe that? And here's something.
Just to test that thought experiment,
Yeah,
I could conceive of, like, let's say Amir in uh planet B um being upset to be called planet B. He thinks it's planet A, but never mind. Having a dream uh that he forgets, that is in the morning, different from the dream that I have that I forget in the morning, and everything else being exactly the same.
yeah, but you have to remember, you have to also imagine that during that time when you and Twin Amir are having those dreams, you're having different dreams, but there's nothing physically, nothing that explains physically or um, why those are different dreams. And
Yeah.
I just want to say, I can't even imagine what that would mean. That just seems bizarre to me. If
Yeah,
I
I mean, obviously, I'm not a neuroscientist, or,
Yeah,
but there are lots of, like, where it's tricky to find where memory is in the brain, and
yeah,
people have wild experiences on psychedelics and near-death experiences where
yeah.
most of the brain seems to, like, not be functioning, or certainly not functioning in a way that yeah, the correlations between mental activity and what's discoverable, which it might just be a matter of time, and you might be right. Like in 50 years, we'll find every particular nuance of thought has a correlate in the chemistry and
But I don't think
electromagnetic.
that's true. I don't think that's true. Just as I don't think being worth $1 has a correlate in the ink and paper on $1 notes.
I
Uh,
see. Okay, so it could show up differently.
could show up with
Yeah.
vastly differently. Here's one way to think about it. When we talk about thoughts and content and so forth, we're often thinking relationally. We're also thinking hermeneutically. We're interpreting ourselves in various ways. And
Is that
inter-
what hermeneutics are, to
yeah,
interpret? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, we're thinking in terms of interpretation. So as you and I are talking, we're both presuming that the other is speaking English,
Hmm.
and we're interpreting the words in the context of the way that they're used in English. When sometimes we switch to Sanskrit, we assume that that word is being used in the same way as it's used by other people who are talking about Sanskrit terms, and so forth. Um, so when we do that, we're constantly engaged in interpretation. And when I think to myself, Amir's got some seriously idealistic sentiments, what I'm doing is interpreting your behavior and your discussion and attributing to you a belief. And when you say, Jay sounds like a really weird, hardcore physicalist, you're interpreting my beliefs, what I'm saying, and so forth, and getting an interpretation of who I am. Um, Interpretations are not the identification of physical phenomena, but they're grounded in physical phenomena. So when I interpret a movie and I say, well, it's very sad, and this director is really reflecting on the transiency of life and the difficulty of caused by political oppression. I'm not saying if you really analyze that celluloid really carefully, you're going to find a correlate in that celluloid of sadness and the dangers of autocracies. I'm saying that's the best reading to give all of this. And that relies on huge backgrounds. And I think in general, that's what our psychological life looks like to us and to others. It's the result of an interpretation.
So I haven't understood this one yet. Um, Maybe on listening to it again, I will. So I just wanted to admit that I haven't
That's
understood this
okay.
yet.
And I might be wrong, but
And there might be other resources that, well, even if you're wrong, what you're saying is comprehensible to yourself. So there's a way of understanding it, which I haven't got yet. So just to admit that, but I don't want to spend more time on it because I'm sure either listening to it again or there might be other resources and courses you can send which might go through it. Uh, but maybe just to finish on one last question to round this bit off.
sure.
Um, and is part of what I'm struggling with, which is it still sounds like there's physical stuff and there's mental stuff.
No, I don't, no, stop right there. I don't think there's stuff, right? There's
Right.
physical descriptions of the world, and there's psychological or economic descriptions of the world. They're all descriptions of the same world using different kinds of perspectives. Um, and the psychological, the economic supervene on the physical level. That is, fix things at the physical level. You're going to fix it up there. But that doesn't mean there's different kinds of stuff. One kind of stuff, just stuff.
Because the stuff that I know exists are feelings, thoughts, perceptions, colors, tastes.
Yeah, you do.
Um, w which, if I take them in totality of like, what do they have in common? Well, they're all experiences.
Yeah,
My sense is that whilst it's very intuitive to anyone above the age of 2 or 3, I don't know when sense object permanency kicks in, that the chair exists when I leave the room. I still see that as something inferred, that it has some kind of physical
yeah.
thing, which I don't know what it is. I can't even imagine it because it isn't an experience. Yet I say that I think you probably know by now what I'm getting at. It kind of seems to evoke another way of being in the world that isn't experienced, that I don't have access to. So when you say there aren't two kinds of stuff, it sounds
Mhm.
idealist. It sounds inclined towards idealism because we know that experiences exist, and we infer that physical objects continue to exist outside of the experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where am I misunderstanding you, or where is the
Because you're suggesting that experiences exist as a different kind of stuff.
what?
And I think experiences are just events in the world, like the scrapings of chairs,
Yeah,
like the
no, I thought what you were saying is when I leave the room and there's no one else in the room, the chair continues to exist, but it doesn't exist as the feelings I have about the chair. It doesn't exist as
because
touch. It doesn't
that's
exist as
right, because
color.
the chair is not a collection of experiences. The chair is something that one of which one has collection of experiences, but it's not that collection. It's an object that we designate based on a bunch of experiences, a bunch of conventions and things, but it's not those experiences.
But it doesn't exist separately from imputation and designation, right? It
That's
doesn't.
right. That's right. But imputation and designation designate a physical object on the basis of a set of experiences that we've had and a set of conceptions of what physical objects are
That,
and so
that,
forth.
sorry to interrupt, but just so you hone in right in on my where I'm not understanding you. You said it's a designation on experiences of a physical object. But what do you mean by physical object? Because all I have are the experiences. As you can see, I'm kind of steeped in
No,
this like idea.
no, I think you actually have, I mean, your experiences are what mediate your knowledge of the physical object. Remember what you're doing right now, I think that what's making it hard for you to understand this, to the extent that it is hard, um, is that you are suggesting that the things that we posit, the things that we take to exist in our world, are nothing more than the evidence that we have for them. Whereas I want to say that the experience that we have that mediates our interaction with the world, that gives us evidence for the reality of things in the world, gives us evidence through theories, through understanding, through inference of things that exist beyond that. And that those things become those physical objects, those non-mental objects, if you want. That what I mean by that is objects described in a non-mental vocabulary um, are best explained by physical science as things that can have existence at times when they're not even seen, when they're not heard, and so forth. The fact that our data are punctual and in and non-continuous doesn't mean that they are data for the existence of punctual non-continuous things.
And where I get stuck is because I know that experiences exist,
Yeah,
and you're not saying physical things have a different kind of existence. There's only
no,
one kind of existence.
yeah,
And you're saying they exist outside of any experience.
yeah.
So that's where I'm like, how can it be both? And maybe this is because you're comfortable with contradiction. How
No,
can
no,
it be both?
nothing
How,
contradictory here. Nothing contradictory. Physical objects interact with us causally to give rise to experiences. Um, Experiences are not, special non-physical things. They're what happens to physical organisms like us when we engage with other physical organisms, other physical objects. Nothing mysterious about that. But we're not always engaging with them. But the best explanation of their ability to give us the experiences that they do when they interact is in terms of sciences that require that they continue existing even when they're not interacting with us.
yeah,
Nothing mysterious about that.
I'm not, nothing I've said has meant to be an attack on science or
Oh, no, I'm
to,
not. I
yeah,
know. Yeah.
to imply that we shouldn't take science
I'm
seriously.
just trying to say that as we take the science more seriously, as the background of what we're doing when we think of things as physical objects, then it becomes harder and harder to give those physical objects a non-continuous identity, since our best science presupposes and requires a continuous identity. We don't have a physics of of objects that pop in and out of existence, depending on whether we're looking at them. We don't have a chemistry or a biology of systems or organisms that are constantly popping in and out of existence. Those require a certain kind of continuity. And that's part of what we get along with our picture of the world, is a picture of how the world hangs together to be explained.
Okay, let me continue to contemplate that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there uh as all I mean, these conversations never end, and perhaps you'll have capacity to do a follow-up one day. Um, but it's been close to 2 hours, so I just want to
Yeah.
finish with some gratitude and also,
Well,
again,
thank you.
yeah, it's been just fantastic to have this
And
opportunity to dialogue with you. And
well, thank you. The gratitude goes both ways. I really have enjoyed this conversation enormously.
likewise,
Thank you for the opportunity just to be able to share these ideas with a larger audience in a really congenial way. Thank you so much.
is there anything else that you feel would be useful to say to frame some of what we've spoken about, or
Well, just to remember that no matter what our metaphysical or epistemological views are, the rubber hits the road when it gets to ethics, and how we think about one another and how we treat one another. And that's what to take most seriously.
great. Thank you, Jay, so much. What's next for you? It's a
What's
Sunday, I guess, and
Sunday, and I've got one more week before I begin teaching in my very last semester of teaching. So I'm going to be visiting some friends, doing a few chores, but mostly getting ready for my swan song semester.
oh wow, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
so I
amazing,
retire in a few months. Yeah.
amazing to be part of it. Okay,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much, Amir.
And I could cut it there if you're not comfortable with this question being on record.
Okay.
But just a personal curiosity, because I'm Jewish. I used to be in yeshiva, and
Mhm.
the only other place where I see people rock forward and back in study and debate was there. So
Ah,
I just did have the question like, oh, is this? It's the only thing that made me think, oh, I wonder if Jay's Jewish, because sometimes you
so
have
we
the
share more than you think. I'm Jewish and got started in yeshiva too.
okay, right. That makes sense of that. Yeah, typical mannerism. Great, cool. Again, thank you so much, and see you another
Okay.
time, please.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.